Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. IVF clinic bombing in Palm Springs, California is still making news. The new update is a person called Daniel Park is arrested for providing ammunition to Guy Bartkus. Park is from Washington state and he flew away to Poland after the bombing but was promptly deported back and arrested. We'll be reviewing some articles that have been a reaction to the bombing event later on in the video. But before that, just a reminder of the lecture on 16th June 4:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. UK time that is part of the Parfit Memorial Lecture Series at Ushiro Oxford Institute. Professor Jacob Nebel will be talking about the Procreation Asymmetry. It's a free lecture and you can join online, but you still have to book a seat. Link for booking will be in the description. And then there is annual Ushiro Lecture Series on reproductive justice on 6th November, 13th November and 20th November. All three lectures are by Kimberly Brownlee, who is Canada Research Chair in Ethics and Political and Social Philosophy at the University of British Columbia. First one, which is on 6th November, will be on male reproductive dependency. November 13th lecture will be on societal and specific dependency, and the third on 20th November will be on female reproductive rights. November is still many months away, and so abstracts of those lectures are not yet out. So not sure to what extent antinatalism will be covered, but we'll keep an eye on updates as they come. On Being Misinterpreted is a short article in the Philosophical Salon by David Benatar. This is about IVF clinic bombing in Palm Springs, California on 17th of May by Guy Bartkus. David Benatar's main claim in this article is that most of the media reports wrongly attribute Bartkus's bombing to antinatalism. Media's misinterpretation of antinatalism is similar to Bartkus's misinterpretation. Benatar says the press has joined the terrorist in misconstruing what antinatalism is. He cites and clarifies multiple misinterpretations. One is antinatalism is not negative utilitarianism. Contrary to common assertions, I am not a utilitarian, and my arguments for antinatalism do not presuppose any particular ethical theory. Secondly, antinatalism is not nihilism. Nihilism, at least about values, claims that there are no values, nothing is good or bad, and nothing matters morally. This is not true of antinatalism, which very emphatically values the avoidance of inflicting harm. And thirdly, antinatalism is not pro-mortalism. The fact that death is such a serious harm is one reason why I am not a pro-mortalist, which is somebody who is in favor of death. Another reason for my opposition to inflicting death on others is that it violates their rights to make their own decisions. Another common misinterpretation is between legal rights and moral wrongs. To this, he says, although procreation is morally wrong, there are very good reasons not to restrict people's reproductive freedom. People should have a legal right to do some things that are morally wrong. Finally, antinatalism is not violence. Any benign view could be twisted and overlaid with dangerous ideas, so he appeals to journalists that they should approach the world with the nuance that its complexity requires. Now, I'm not a journalist, but I have been accused of misinterpreting David Benatar on multiple occasions, so I take it as a point to be more careful on this matter. There is an excellent article, Against the Tide, Rethinking the Value of Coming into Existence, by someone called Leo. It's a lengthy article, but every bit of it is very high quality. It covers a range of topics starting from the IVF clinic bombing to antinatalism and Efilism. It also talks at length about Benatar's axiological asymmetry and his quality of life argument. Yoshizawa Fumitake's criticism of Benatar's asymmetry is referenced, and so is Shauna Schifrin's argument against bestowing benefits. There are some very good clarifications about common misunderstandings about antinatalism and Benatar's arguments. Leo compares the case of Charles Murray. Murray is a philosophical scientist. In his book, The Bell Curve, he seems to have presented a correlation between intelligence and certain groups of people. On individual level, intelligence is heritable to a certain extent. Those who studied this on individual level faced no social resistance. But when Murray took these findings on group level, he started getting cancelled in universities. His fault was challenging the status quo and existing hierarchies. Leo compares this case to antinatalist philosophers. He also draws on one asymmetry in reaction to Efilism after the IVF bombing. Reddit's response was to ban Efilist communities, citing safety concerns. Yet, unlike Efilism, which is associated with at least one confirmed act of violence, the harms produced by powerful institutional forces such as police departments are systemic, ongoing, and extensively documented, and yet no comparable action is taken against subreddits aligned with those institutions. Natalist ideologies, for their part, are implicated in countless more cases of violence violence, from domestic abuse and forced childbirth to large-scale structural harms like child poverty, medical neglect, and coerced reproduction. Yet, they remain culturally and algorithmically protected. The asymmetry is telling. Another good point was about Russian roulette. Although Russian roulette is used as an analogy to explain risks that we impose on children by bringing them here, the reality is even worse. The article presents statistics about suicides and suicide attempts to show that a person playing Russian roulette with a single bullet in a 6-chamber revolver has 1 in 6 chance, that is 16.7%, of dying. A human being born into this world has roughly 1 in 4 chance, 25%, of attempting suicide at some point in life. In purely probabilistic terms, your child is statistically more likely to attempt suicide than to lose a game of Russian roulette. Finally, the article concludes with a point similar to what David Benatar had made about the IVF bombing. Had the parents of Palm Springs bomber made that unthinkable choice, there would have been no Guy Bardkas to grieve a close friend's murder, no one to spiral into suffering, no clinic to attack, no embryos endangered, no Efilism to be scapegoated, and no tragic aftermath to analyze. I write this with deep sympathy for both him and his parents, but sympathy alone is not enough to break the chain. Speaking of this tragedy, there are 3 related articles sprouted from this event. Katharine D has interviewed 2 leaders of the world of Efilism, Inmendham and Amanda Sukenick. Both interviews are available on her website default.blog, although behind a paywall. First few questions of Amanda's interview are available for free. These 2 interviews have culminated in a more condensed version on piratewires.com, the YouTubers preaching human extinction. Let's look at this one first before going into the long interviews. This Pirate Wires article talks about antinatalism in general, but the main focus is rather on Efilism. Katharine takes us on a little tour of Efilist antinatalist YouTube history, which starts in late 2000s and early 2010s. If you are an old-timer in this community, then reading this, you will feel nostalgic about all those years in the past and how things have come to be thus far about Efilism and antinatalism. If you are relatively new, then this will be a good educational dive into the history of internet-based Efilism and antinatalism. We see Inmendham's early years of video making, his changing backgrounds, his physics adventures, his speaking styles, his anger and emotional outbursts, and many other nuances, and how he came to the conclusions that he came to. On the way, Katharine tends to psychologize the human behind Inmendham. He was a man who had weaponized his delusionment into all-consuming philosophical crusade against existence itself. Inmendham was Generation X distilled to its essence, someone who had absorbed all the broken promises of the Reagan era and transformed them into a philosophy broadcasting decades of accumulated grievance to the world from a webcam, a one-man theater of cosmic pessimism. Then there was also Kirk Neville, who went by the name Derived Energy. In the early days of YouTube video making, Inmendham disagreed with Derived Energy. He was an antinatalist for what I consider to be completely irrational reasons, says Inmendham about Derived Energy, before dismissing him as a nihilist who didn't give a fuck about anything's welfare. But, and here's an interesting part, beneath the public sparring was a genuine affection. Kirk was imprisoned in one of Indonesia's harshest prisons for a crime he didn't do. Inmendham and other community members tried to secure his release through a petition. That was unsuccessful and Kirk eventually died over there. On this news, Inmendham was devastated. At the same time comes the daughter of a psychoanalyst mother and an artist father, Amanda Sukenick. Impressed by Inmendham's arguments in middle of her toy reviewing, Amanda takes Efilism into the art world. She makes sculptures of Inmendham and a movie called Efilist. With her now banned YouTube channel, Amanda becomes a leading figure in the world of both Efilism and antinatalism. One bit of tabloid news, the article states that Sukenick, despite her continued philosophical agreement with Inmendham, recently had a personal falling out with him that she describes as relatively ugly. She elaborates on this in her detailed interview, which we'll look at later on. But there are stark differences between her and Inmendham. Where Inmendham's Efilism comes wrapped in righteous anger, Sukenick delivers the same philosophy with the soft voice of someone who might spend her afternoons as a children's librarian reading picture books to toddlers before retiring to an evening of tabletop role-playing games. Knowing Amanda for all these many years, I think I agree with this assessment. However, there are some points in the article with which I won't agree as readily. The subtext, for example, a group of antinatalist YouTubers inspired recent terror attacks attack on an IVF clinic and allegedly motivated Adam Lanza. One, the active voice tends to say that antinatalists almost conspired in grooming these men to act, which is not actually the case. Secondly, both Guy Bardkus and Adam Lanza were inspired by antinatalism, but the main motivator of their action were their own mental illness and emotional situations, which something the article also points out. The Bardkus case, however, presents a clearer link between Efilism and actual violence. His manifesto explicitly cited Efilism, yet even here Sukenick points out that the connection is complicated by personal factors. The recent death of his closest friend, a history of mental illness, and what appears to have been monumental despair. This is something Katharine herself made a point of in her previous article, which we already covered last week. Overall, the article is good and an honest introduction to these two Efilists. I say honest because Katharine does not hold back from some provocative language that Inmendham has used in the past. For example, this quote from one of his videos: "I have absolutely no ethical problem personally with every fucking poor person who has a kid being shot in the fucking head." But there's also Inmendham's confession: "It has taken many years for me to control those emotions enough to prevent unuseful emotional outbursts." As for the connection between antinatalism or Efilism and violence, Amanda is clear in saying fuck anyone who tries to harm others in the name of antinatalism or Efilism. Katharine also notes that most people in Discord servers and Reddit groups and other such forums for these ideologies appear content to simply discuss their ideas. There is little, if any, violent rhetoric to be found, just people talking. Violence is an aberration, not the rule. There is something so sterile in Efilist discussion. The ideas that are discussed are sometimes violent. That is inherent given these discussions are philosophical in nature. Red button, for example, is discussed quite often. Amanda and Mati even go into many variants of this button in their book on antinatalism. But these are thought experiments. The red button of Efilist imagination remains safely hypothetical, but the questions it represents are real. How much suffering is acceptable as the price of consciousness? What obligations do we have to beings who do not yet exist? These are not questions that admit easy answers, but they are questions that an honest engagement with existence cannot avoid. Then there is categorization of ideas. Katharine states Benatarian antinatalism, which argues it's better never to have been born, and Efilism, which extends antinatalism beyond humans to all sentient beings, arguing humans have a duty to prevent contribution of all sentient life. On the surface, this looks like an error. It appears, at least to my eyes, that Benatarian antinatalism is only for humans, which is not the case. Benatar has on many occasions and at many places, even within Better Never to Have Been, said that his arguments apply to all sentient beings and not just to humans. But this is elaborated properly in the long version of Amanda's interview, an unabridged conversation with an Efilist, my conversation with Amanda Sukenick. This is a detailed interview of 21 questions. Through this, we get to know who Amanda really is. One example is the question about any means necessary. Amanda has been quoted in some videos saying something on the lines of ending suffering by any means necessary. She clarifies that philosophical conclusions are not always convenient, but there needs to be real separation made between overarching horrific philosophical conclusions and real-world prescriptive actions. They don't have to and should not in many cases follow one another. In other words, philosophical conclusions come with a lot of preconditions and caveats. Unless those preconditions are met, implementing them in practice is dangerous. While it might well be true that any means necessary might be worth the end of suffering, the realities of any possible real-world application have to take precedence. These realities include the cost that we would have to pay. So even if the reward of ending suffering might far outweigh the cost, the utilitarian calculation is not the only one to consider. One objection is that this would be violating autonomy of others. Another objection is that there is no guarantee that ending of all suffering will actually be achieved, and we might end up with a botched up operation resulting in a situation even worse than what we have now. That's why Amanda says we as antinatalists and Efilists must be civilizationists before we get to be extinctionists. Another example is where she is asked how the real world should look like if antinatalist and Efilist conclusions were to be accepted. The whole answer is on your screen. I am not going to read it all, but basically she is saying that give people reproductive freedom and also freedom to abortion as well as freedom to die. Then research on how best to end the existence of the rest of sentience. Here I think she means means minimal or no harm. I don't think this should be interpreted as killing off extinction, that is, bringing about extinction by killing existing individuals. Massive research will have to be undertaken on how to bring about the dying of extinction. Whether this is antinatalism or Efilism or some other kind of ism is debatable, but the fact is we are in a completely opposite direction today. At least three aspects come to my mind. De-extinction of already extinct species is going on by some scientists. People want to not only populate every corner of Earth, but also want to expand beyond this planet. And manufacturing artificial sentience is becoming a real possibility. So, at the very least, we can say that right now we are in a completely opposite direction and we need a U-turn. Overall, this is an excellent interview, and I hope it clears up many of the misunderstandings and rumors that have circulated about Amanda. About her disagreements with Inmendham, she says, I have nothing against Inmendham. I don't think that he is a bad person, and I regret that things are the way they are. Speaking of Inmendham, his interview was also published by Katharine. It was terse and sounded almost confrontational to me. It also left me unsatisfied on some questions. For example, when asked about the biggest misunderstanding about Efilism, he said, it is really this simple. Feelings make value, brain makes feelings, and animals have brains that feel. The philosophy is not a prescription, it's a diagnosis. There's no reasonable justification for misunderstanding. What does that mean? Maybe what he means here is Efilism is not normative. It is only talking about badness of coming into existence, be it for humans or non-humans. Or is he saying that this is such a simple concept that there is no justification of misunderstanding it? But that wasn't the question. So it looks a little ironical that an answer to clarify biggest misunderstanding is so cryptic. Or maybe it is cryptic just to my brain. Another example is about ending suffering by any means. This is the same question that even Amanda was asked. Inmendham says, if you could prevent 10 people from having cancer by giving 9 people cancer, would you be rationally obligated to do it? In one day on Earth, there is an amount of suffering endured too massive to be imagined. Multiply that by a million or a billion. How could any cure I propose be worse than letting that disease take its course? This calculation of saving 10 people at the cost of 9 needs qualification. Are those 9 different people? In which case, this is a classic trolley problem and does not have a straightforward answer. But I agree with his larger point about suffering in the world. It needs an urgent attention. Inmendham's style is not exactly foolproof, but he has a valid point. What confuses me is whether that urgency justifies taking actions by any means necessary, because that was the original question. Also, we see a contradiction. At one point, we see that this philosophy is not a prescription but a diagnosis, but then it also proposes an action. At any rate, as far as I know, Inmendham does not give a lot of interviews, so this one is one of those rare ones. And after all of this, I have a bit of an anticlimax to share. Katharine tweets that in an email, the philosopher David Benatar told me that he doesn't think there's any reason for Efilism to exist. I asked her what exactly Benatar had said. She will be uploading the correspondence soon, so looking forward to that. There's a comic booklet on Antinatalism by a Bulgarian author, Joseph Bini Mammoth. It's called Mammothests from All Around the Globe. Not sure if Joseph Bini is the real name or not, but the comic is available to download for free until June 12th on the link in description. The comic features two main voices, a vertical voice which is images and text, and a horizontal voice which is text only. The author recommends reading the vertical voice first and then returning to beginning to read the horizontal one. Now on to some notable videos. They are fewer this time because I spent most of my time reading those articles and news. Brittany Hartley is the author of No Nonsense Spirituality, All the Tools, No Beliefs Required. Looking at the description on Amazon and the sample section, it looks like a mixture of psychology, philosophy, along with a lot of importance to emotions. She makes a video on her channel No Nonsense Spirituality about the recent IVF clinic bombing and through it about antinatalism. She makes some good points and some not very good points. Her description of Benatar's axiological asymmetry and its criticism is misplaced. She also indicates that antinatalism is only for humans and Efilism for all life. This is quite a common misunderstanding. She also mixes nihilism and antinatalism. Within nihilism, she uses existential nihilism and does not differentiate it from moral nihilism. Most of the time, by nihilism, she probably means means loss of terrestrial meaning, but without clarifying or qualifying that. She claims that our philosophy is a function of our psychological state. This is actually true for many of us. We are emotional beings and we see the world through emotional lenses. However, that does not mean that we can't make independent evaluations. But she makes some good points too, especially about forums like Reddit, where many people confuse pessimistic philosophies as a refuge for their mental distress. She tries to talk such people out of psychological problems and tries to provide the much needed rose tinted glasses so they can enjoy their existence. But while doing that, she also tries to use those rosy glasses to deny philosophical concepts, which I think is an error. At any rate, she means good. I may not agree on some points she makes, or I might have misunderstood them, but it is appreciable that she is helping those who already exist. On a channel called Bohdan Project, Lawrence was interviewed. He talks about arguments for antinatalism, how different people view it, his experience in talking to people about it, veganism, his vasectomy, and so many other topics. It's a 1 hour and 35 minutes long interview with a lot of engaging content. Psychology Sundays is a channel by a professional counselor and psychologist, Dr. Anuradha Harkare. She has about 64,000 subscribers. She made a video in Marathi about being child free and how our perspective has to change towards those who don't want to have children. Now, this is not antinatalism, but I still wanted to mention this for two reasons. One, it is in Marathi, which is a language that I speak, but is also spoken by 130 million people, and yet there is almost no one talking on this subject. Secondly, this is a heavily pronatalist society. Women who don't have children are still viewed as abnormal. So any step which helps to normalize not having children voluntarily is welcome. And therefore, thanks to Anuradha for covering this topic. Now, some pronatalism this week. Making America Pregnant Again, the pro-natalist movement, is the title of a new episode by The Guardian. Helen Pidd talks to Guardian's US columnist Moira Donegan, who studies this subject. She talks about this so-called pro-natalist movement, mainly in America, and the natal conference that recently happened. In the background, there are three most powerful men in the world who openly support the pro-natalist movement. In the episode, we hear snippets from actual speeches in the natal conference. Apart from that, there were some really interesting and important points made. Pro-natalist movement is not a grassroots movement. There are different factions within the movement, the conservative religious versus the techno-futurists. There are racial undertones to the movement. There are fewer women and there are misogynistic components in the pro-natalist movement. Charles Haywood, who is one of the sponsors of natal conferences, said women should be socially stigmatized for having careers. Moira demonstrates with evidence from the conference that it was not just about having more babies, but about having right kind of babies, like eugenics. One interesting idea Moira brings up is eugenic narcissism. So eugenics is selective breeding of people, but eugenic narcissism attributes success of a person to who they are and ignores the social situation that the person was born into. So Elon Musk is very successful because he has some qualities present in every cell of his body, namely his DNA. That must be very flattering for Elon Musk, and that is part of the appeal of pro-natalist movement. Demography, fertility rates, their inverse correlation to women's improvement, and actual pronatalist policies that do not work are also discussed. Fertility rate drop in the US is mainly attributable to reduction in teen pregnancies. Other reasons include cost of childbearing and parenting demands. However, pronatalists think that the real reasons are shifting values. Basically, women are thinking wrong. They also discuss Trump's pronatalist ideas, which include reservation in Fulbright program for married people with children, $5,000 for having a child, and a medal for mothers of 6 or more children. That medal idea is proposed by Collins's couple, but it is not a new idea anyway. Such medals were given to German mothers by the Nazi government between 1939 and 1945. Just that instead of 6 children, they had to have at least 4 children. History of pronatalism is gilded with eugenics. Unheard had an article by Sarah Dittam, Nigel Farage's cynical pronatalism, his benefits U-turn is shameless. Nigel Farage, for those who don't follow British politics, is leader of radical right-wing party Reform UK and was previously leader of now defunct party UKIP, which was equally right-wing. Just for the context, it was Nigel Farage and his right-wing extremism which put the pressure on David Cameron to conduct the Brexit referendum. I won't go into details of political U-turns here because that would require you to know political background in the UK. But the main points to take away are that the pronatalism of the right that we see so commonly in the US and some European countries like Italy and Hungary is now spilling over in the UK as well. Secondly, it is the same contradiction that they face, that they are in principle opposed to the state provided benefits and are at least concerned about actual childbearing costs, but at the same time, they're worried about declining birth rates of native populations or there not being right kind of babies. And so they just view women as baby making machines and children as a means. This is all coming to the UK. That's all I have for this week. Thanks for watching.